Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth part of our fifth lecture in this introduction to phonology. We're now going to turn to a topic which includes a wide variety of processes. And so it's actually fairly important to understand what this notion of neutralization means. Looking etymologically, we can see that this contains the root of neuter, as in neuter gender, which shows that it would say that there is no contrast. So to neutralize something means to eliminate the contrast. And here we can first refer back to the notion of contextually limited contrast, which I introduced at the end of the second lecture. There, contextually limited contrast referred to instances where two or more sounds in a language could be shown to be phonemically contrastive, because we could find minimal pairs, or we could find those two sounds in the same phonological context. But there are phonological contexts in the language where the difference, the distinction between those two sounds would be lost. If we think back to the case of nasals in Aininka Apuru Kayali in week 2, there we could see that we needed to have a phonemic labial nasal and a phonemic coronal nasal, I think because both sounds could occur before a vowel at the beginning of a word. But preceding a stop, if I recall the data correctly, these two sounds would be neutralized in place of articulation. So for instance, if the language had an underlying sequence ka or ka, both of those would be neutralized to a velar nasal preceding a velar stop. And we can see right now something sort of similar based on some Japanese data. So in that case, the notion of the existence of contextually limited contrast in Aininka Purukayali was based on a purely static generalization. We didn't look at the morphological structure of the words there whatsoever. In Japanese, however, we will look at some morphological structure. So we have different forms of a few different verbs. Verbs in the negative, so not die, the volitional, meaning want to die, the present, dies, and the past, died, shinanai, shinitai, shinu, shinda. And in that case, I've already given morpheme boundaries with a dash in all of these cases. And so it's relatively easy, it seems, to recover the correct underlying representation for each verbal stem by simply looking at the forms where the inflectional ending begins with a vowel. So in the negative, the volitional, and the present, it looks like we have an inflectional suffix. There are several different suffixes, anai, itai, u. And so we have words like, for instance, shin, shin, dai. On to Japanese now. Must have a coronal nasal because a coronal nasal appears there before a vowel. Whereas, for instance, the verbal stem meaning live occurs with a labial nasal. So it seems reasonable to assume that we have a labial nasal here. When we, however, look at the past tense forms, look at this column for the past tense, we see immediately preceding the suffix, which occurs there, so we always have a suffix of the form da occurring there, we only find a coronal nasal. There's never a labial nasal occurring in this case. And if there, we can use a rule of place assimilation of the place of articulation, in order to account for this phenomenon. So this rule, given in 21, states that a nasal segment takes on the place of articulation, so labial or coronal or dorsal, of a following consonant. And based on the information in the pre-vocalic context, we can say precisely what the underlying representation should be for the verbal stem. So coronal in the case of die, go back, but labial in the case of all of the other verbs given in 3 through 7 there. So what we concretely see in Japanese, in this case, is that there is there must be an underlying contrast between a labial nasal and a coronal nasal. So we don't have exactly a true minimal pair, but we have near minimal pairs. So we can say that we have a, should have found a verb with a vowel E. That would have been a bit nicer, but we can see clearly that we have a coronal, both. We can make the statement that both coronal and labial nasals may occur before a vowel. But preceding a consonant, the place of articulation of a nasal is neutralized. So if a labial consonant occurs before a non-syllabic segment like duh, as in the past tense, the nasal is required, it must take on the place of articulation of that consonant. So to be a bit more precise, we might say that neutralization processes occur when there is some environment in which two phonemes have the same allophone. So what this data would also show us, it's clear, of course, that the phoneme na must have the allophone na. But if we look at the cases in which the verbal stem has a labial nasal, that allows us to see, the phoneme of the labial nasal must have at least two allophones. Its allophones must be at least a labial nasal and a coronal nasal. If we had time in the exercises in week 4 to talk about the word for bokhon in Japanese, there we saw this same phenomenon occurring with this word, and we can represent the phonemic relations among labial phonemes in Japanese as in 23. There are two phonemic labial nasal phonemes, but any underlying nasal phoneme can be realized as any one of 3 different nasal phonemes. It can be realized as coronal, as dorsal, or as labial, depending upon what the context is. If the following consonant, I should add minus syllabic here to each of these contexts to be a bit more precise, but that's encoded in the rule anyway. Then these different sounds occur. So this means that the 2 nasal phonemes of Japanese, the labial nasal n and the coronal nasal n, all share the same allophones, namely a coronal nasal n, a dorsal nasal n, and a labial nasal n. So there is a complete overlap between the underlying phonemes and their possible allophones. Now, if we think about the situation of a child trying to learn Japanese, they're in an interesting situation in which they encounter past tense forms where there is a nasal immediately preceding the past tense suffix. If say a child had only heard the past tense form of the verb ask, tanonda, then the child would not necessarily be sure. We would think the child wouldn't be able to predict exactly what the present tense form should be, because assuming that the child has already learned that nasal assimilation is part of the phonology of Japanese, the present could theoretically be either tanonu or tanon. Either would be possible, because we know that whatever the underlying nasal is, it must have been neutralized to a coronal nasal, in this context, preceding a coronal stop. Let's consider the Japanese case in a little more detail, thinking about how such cases of neutralization could arise. The first requirement that we need is that the language has to have a phonological rule that would result in contextually limited contrast. In this case, in Japanese, the contrast between distinct nasal phonemes, which differ in place of articulation underlyingly, is allowed only preceding vowels. So only if the nasal is before a vowel is the difference between a labial nasal and a coronal nasal able to occur. Now, if all Japanese words were purely monomorphemic, that is, if all words of Japanese did not consist of more than one morpheme, it would be hard to establish the existence of the phonological rule in 21, this rule of nasal assimilation. But it would still need to be the case that for many words, we wouldn't know whether we should put an underlying labial nasal or a coronal nasal, or simply an underspecified nasal segment without a major place feature in the underlying representation. And that is exactly the situation that we found for the Aininka Apurukayali language that we discussed in week 2. Even the native speaker that we discussed there wasn't sure what the underlying nasal should be in monomorphemic words where there was a nasal occurring before a consonant. The second requirement that we need in order to discover such cases of neutralization is that we have to have the morphology of the language providing the environment that permits the contrast, but only some of the time, not all of the time. So in the Japanese data, we see that for the same verbal stem, so given the verbal stem sin, for instance, live, that stem can occur both in environments where the contrast is allowed, so in the negative, volitional, and present forms of the verb, that verbal stem occurs before a vowel, so it's occurring in the context in which the contrast between a labial nasal and a coronal nasal is permitted. But it also needs to occur in contexts where the contrast is not permitted, namely before a consonant. And thus the underlying contrast gets neutralized, the underlying contrast is destroyed, so to say, when the morphology fails to provide the environment which is needed for the maintenance of underlying contrast. All right, let's take another brief break at this point, and then we'll continue. I'll introduce a specific method for trying to discover such neutralizing alternations like we've just seen in Japanese.